Greetings, everyone, again, and thank you so much for joining us for our global webinar series, At the Edge of the Margins, the Impact of COVID-19 on Women in the Sex Trade. My name is Taina Bieneme, and I'm the Executive Director of the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women. Today's discussion focuses on the Australian state of Victoria's proposal to further decriminalize the sex trade. We're thrilled to welcome four stellar and brave Australian experts who will help us understand how and why Victoria wants to deregulate the sex trade and commercial sexual exploitation. As brief background, in 1994, Victoria enacted the Prostitution Control Act to regulate brothels, control prostitution, bring it above ground, implement workplace rights and protections, and improve the safety for women in prostitution. The Premier of Victoria, Daniel Andrews, publicly acknowledged that the law miserably failed at all levels. In the last 27 years, the sex trade has expanded at least fivefold. Sex trafficking is a given, with an overwhelming number of foreign women, mostly from Asia and the Pacific Islands, sold in brothels, bought in brothels, especially in unlicensed massage parlors. Incomprehensibly, as a solution to these documented human rights abuses because of legalization, Premier Daniel Andrews wants to further deregulate the sex trade to allow it to flourish in apartments, massage parlors, and street prostitution. In August 2021, that's this year, we sent Premier Andrews a global letter with close to 300 signatories from around the world that included sex trafficking, prostitution, and pornography survivors, condemning the bill. The letter noted that decriminalization of the sex trade was steeped not only in systemic misogyny, but was also a direct legacy of the sexual exploitation, rape, and torture of Indigenous women by European colonialists in 18th century Australia. In October 2021, we received a response from the Honorable Melissa Horne, MP, Minister for Consumer Affairs, Gaming and Liquor Regulation, stating in part that a review of the bill conducted by MP Fiona Patten consulted with a wide range of stakeholders, including the industry sectors, which means the sex trade, and that, I quote, decriminalization will ensure every worker in the industry is protected under law as they are in any other job, and that only sex work between consenting adults will be decriminalized. The United Nations Committee for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW, expressed its deep concern that Australia was failing not only in meeting its obligations under Article 6 of the Convention, which requires signatories to address the trafficking and exploitation of prostitution of women and girls, but also in its obligations to reduce demand for the services of women in prostitution and provide alternatives to them. The government of Australia scoffed at the CEDAW committee's recommendations, stating that it does not consider, and I quote, legalized sex work as exploitation of prostitution. When we know that the sex trade is where sex trafficking happens and that it is fueled by the male demand for prostitution and the male demand for power, that it is inherently violent, racist, and sexist, Australia's disregard for the rule of law and Victoria's cruel indifference to the suffering of exploited and prostituted women and girls, especially women and girls of color, is nothing short of callous. Our extraordinary panelists today are experts on violence against women and girls and on the relationships between the sex trade, including pornography and prostitution, and sex-based and gender inequalities. We're amazed to have three academics with us, all from Melbourne, Victoria. Tegan Laren, the public officer of the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women Australia, CATWA, who is currently completing a PhD at Monash University. Dr. Megan Taylor, a senior lecturer based in the Center for People, Organization, and Work at RMIT University. And Dr. Kay Kwek, who is a lecturer in global studies in the School of Global, Urban, and Social Studies at RMIT University, and is the author of Marriage Trafficking, Women in Forced Wedlock. Each of them worked tirelessly with CATWA. And for anyone who's curious, While CatW International and CatWa share a name, we're independent organizations from each other. We're sisters in the same combat, just not in the same administration. And it is a particular honor to welcome the incredible Simone Watson, who joins us from Western Australia. Simone is a sex trade survivor activist and who was actually exploited in Victoria. She's also the director of NORMAC, the Nordic Model Australia Coalition, and a former human rights delegate for Amnesty International. Thank you each for joining us today. So let me start with Tegan. And of course, each of you, could you please explain to us what insanity is happening in Victoria?
Thank you. Thanks so much, Taina. Thanks, everyone. And thanks for inviting me to speak today. It's really an honor to be here with you all to talk about this important issue. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the people of the Kulin Nations on whose land I'm speaking from today, land that was never ceded. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I'd also like to recognise that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women are leaders in working to address the disproportionate levels of violence enacted against them, their children, and their families. So the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women Australia, CatWa, is a non-government feminist organisation working to end all forms of sexual exploitation of women, and we've been operational in Australia for over 27 years. Today, I'll speak a little about the legislative background for the full decriminalisation of prostitution in Victoria, which is the second most populous state in Australia. So Victoria first legalised brothel prostitution in 1984, and then most other forms of prostitution, except for street-based prostitution, in 1994. Prostitution was legalised in Victoria for the primary purpose of controlling and containing the already existing industry and reducing the harm that was already occurring. So it was not because the government at the time thought that prostitution should be considered a career or occupation. So although it wasn't the stated intent at the time, legalisation legitimised prostitution as work, and we've now had almost 40 years of legalisation in Victoria. And a consequence of this is that the sex industry has massively expanded and prostitution has become increasingly normalised and entrenched as legitimate work. So I should quickly note that although prostitution is legalised, the majority of brothels in Victoria are in fact illegal massage parlour brothels. And these venues are estimated to outnumber legal brothels by 5 times. So there are around 90 legal brothels and an estimated 500 illegal massage parlour brothels. So clearly the legalisation has failed to control or contain prostitution. It's also criticised for failing to protect workers in the industry through workplace measures and regulations, as Taina touched on. Nonetheless, what legalisation has done is normalised and entrenched prostitution as work. So the Victorian government is currently in the process of implementing full decriminalisation, which will replace legalisation. So the decriminalisation bill has passed the lower house and is being discussed in the upper house today, I believe, where it has support to pass and will come into effect later this year or early next year. Megan will talk about how the decrim bill came to be, so I'll skip that and get straight to the contents of the bill and how it differs from the current model of legalisation. So decriminalisation is really a worse form of legalisation. Although legalisation legitimised prostitution as a type of work, it also recognised prostitution was not the same as other types of work. So it contains specific regulations aimed at protecting workers, containing the size and locations of the industry, reducing the involvement of organised crime, and so on. Decriminalisation, on the other hand, is based on the premise that sex work is work, literally the same as other types of work. The most pressing harm is positioned as stigma and discrimination, which means that treating the sex industry the same as any other business is seen as reducing stigma and discrimination. And in turn, this is what protects people working in the industry. What this means in practice is that sex industry specific regulations and restrictions currently in place under legalisation are removed. And so our criticism has been that while these changes clearly benefit sex industry businesses, owners, pimps, they put workers, who are mostly women in Australia, mostly Asian women, at greater disadvantage. So, for example, under decriminalisation, they'll remove safe sex provisions, including mandatory condom use. So this is clearly in the interest of businesses because there's a huge demand for sex without a condom, and this makes women less able to refuse sex without a condom, especially if this is brothel policy, and it places women at increased risk of STIs, HIV, etc. Changes to liquor licensing restrictions will also mean that brothels will now be able to sell alcohol. So again, clearly benefits business owners by increasing their revenue, but raises concerns around the health and safety of workers having to deal with intoxicated customers. And also the decriminalisation will remove restrictions on advertising. So again, this will likely benefit sex industry business owners by targeting women for recruitment into the industry, increasing the potential for more explicit marketing, as well as the reach of marketing to increase revenue. The dangers for women in the industry are that brothels advertise on their behalf, which creates certain expectations and demands from the client, and that the individual woman may not want to do, which puts her in increased risk of violence and coercion. Sex industry advertising can also now target vulnerable women for recruitment, and also exposes the public to sexually objectifying marketing, which reinforces harmful gender stereotypes. So these are just some of the examples of how the decriminalisation bill conflates sex industry business interests with that of workers in the industry. This really seems to be the only industry where business owners are assumed to be benevolent towards workers. So although legalization has also been very bad for women in the industry, it at least recognised that some special protections were required. Decriminalisation pretends that prostitution is the same as any other type of work, and which benefits sex industry businesses, but further disadvantages workers in the industry, as those few examples have illustrated. More broadly, decriminalisation further entrenches the total acceptance and normalisation of prostitution, sex buying, and pimping. So I'll leave it there. I think I'm out of time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Who wants to go next?
I think I'm up next.
Hi. Oh, are you? Sorry,
Yep.
you go, Megan.
That's all right, no worries. Thank you again so much for having us all along. And like Tegan, I'm coming to you from Melbourne, so on the stolen lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I think you're going to hear some more from Simone about why it's so important that we link this colonial history to our understanding of the sex industry in Australia. But first, I just want to really briefly put some of Tegan's points about Victoria in a national context. So if we could grab that image of the Australian states and all of their different legislative approaches to show everyone, that would be fabulous. So this might look like a bit of a mess, my apologies, but in my defence, it really is a mess. The kind of situation in Australia is very variable. It's kind of a patchwork approach. Every state has a slightly different model, even if they are broadly under the same category. So we've got everything from total decriminalisation through to legalisation and then criminalisation on the other end. So we've got 6 states and 2 territories here, as you can see, and each is different. You might be able to also pick up, if you can read some of that through the mess, that there is a shift towards total decriminalisation. New South Wales has had that model in place for more than 20 years and was one of the only jurisdictions other than New Zealand to be using that model up until very recently, as I'm sure many of you know. The Northern Territory, though, adopted full decriminalisation only a couple of years ago. And as we're discussing today, Victoria is likely to do this as well in the next couple of days. There's a decriminalisation bill up before the South Australian Parliament at the moment. It's the 14th time that bill has gone up. And Queensland has announced a review considering total decriminalisation this year. So things are changing pretty rapidly. But what's happened in Victoria specifically to get us onto this path, I think is really important to understand and should really be a wake-up call to the rest of the world to see what happens when you normalise the sex industry, as Tegan's just been saying. But we've normalised it to the point that it actually had political representation in Parliament, which I think is quite extraordinary. So to understand where we are now, we need to go back a bit over a decade to 2009, when the Eros Association, which is a sex industry business and employers organisation, moved to found the Sex Party, which is a political party that would advocate for those business interests. And I'm not saying anything controversial, that's exactly what they said at the time that they were doing. The then CEO of the Eros Foundation, Fiona Patten, a name worth remembering if you haven't come across it before, became the Sex Party's first MP, and she won a seat in the upper house of the Victorian Parliament in 2014 on a platform of, amongst other things, pushing for decriminalisation of the sex trade. In 2017, the Sex Party rebranded to appeal to a wider audience and became the Reason Party. And in 2018, the next year, Fiona Patten managed to keep her Legislative Council seat in Victoria, but by a very, very narrow margin. She became one of a number of crossbench parliamentarians holding the balance of power and thereby being able to determine whether or not legislation is passed. In that same 2018 election, the incumbent Labor Party had included in its platform a Law Reform Commission review into the potential decriminalisation of prostitution. Labor were duly re-elected, and in the electoral aftermath, Patten's very close relationship with them became abundantly clear when the Premier went on record to say that he'd be sorry if she lost her place in Parliament and that he would look to find her a job if she did, in fact, lose her place. So if we skip forward a year then to 2019, Labor announced not the promised Law Reform Commission review, but their own review, headed by none other than Fiona Patten herself. So we now have a review into sex industry legislation being headed by someone who's not only campaigned for years in support of one particular legislative approach, but was literally elected as an MP for a party founded to further the interests of sex industry businesses. And surprise, surprise, Patten found that decriminalisation, or really deregulation, as you've already heard, was the best option. But there was not a peep really in our media about the blatant conflict of interest that was involved in this. Journalists looked the other way, and the only opinion piece I saw printed, which brought these issues out for public scrutiny, was actually written by Tegan, who you've just heard from. And that's actually quite a feat because there have only been a handful of articles published in the mainstream press in Victoria critical of the sex industry at all over the last couple of decades. So there were numerous reports as well that the consultation steps excluded survivor groups and individual survivors who sought to be heard as part of that process. But we actually don't know how any of this was handled in the final report provided by Patten to the government, because the government won't release it publicly, claiming it includes information that's too sensitive for distribution. So this is the situation we find ourselves in here in Victoria. After more than 30 years of legalisation, which has also promoted normalisation and acceptance, the end point is that supposedly progressive political and media elites in this state apparently see nothing problematic or even unusual in letting sex industry businesses determine sex industry policy outcomes. So what I'm asking all of you really here today to do is talk to others about what is happening in Victoria, about the corruption of due process that's gone on here and the lack of care for survivors and marginalised women and girls. And please let our experience be a warning to all just not to follow this path. Thanks, that's it from me.
Thank you so much, Megan. Simone, would you like to follow suit?
Hi, thanks so much, Megan and Tegan and Cat W International for having me here. Kaya, everybody. I'm on Peopleman Minang country in the Great Southern of Western Australia. I was born on Lachi Lachi country in Victoria and prostituted under the legal regime, though I hedged into, I've been in other places as well. My grandma, I'm the granddaughter of a Lachi Lachi woman from the Kulin Nation. So I know all this, but I've been listening again to Tegan and Megan sort of summarize it with such clarity, and the rage I feel is just incomprehensible. There's misogyny, and then there's just pure contempt. That contempt is the only thing I can think of in regards to this deregulation. And Fiona Patten and Dan Andrews and Melissa Horn and anyone who supported this should hang their head in shame. You quoted Cedar there. You're talking about Cedar there, Taina. I think it's interesting. This country is run by such a mob of yahoos that it's not just that they scoff. at United Nations conventions or other countries in the world, they just misquote, like our Attorney General in the Northern Territory just misquoted, Article 35 here of CEDAW, and they just make things up as they go along. So I think just my rage has come up this morning. Sorry, it's about 7 a.m. in the morning here, and I was just listening to it all again. Yes, don't let us be an example to you. Australia really is the Wild West. I'm really honoured that you are here, that you're listening to what we have to say. It's a nightmare here in the Northern Territory. The bill that passed there, all the pro-sex work groups called the Scarlet Alliance or SWAP that you have in the USA as well. They didn't bat an eye when that territory, which has the highest ratio per capita of Indigenous women in Australia, said that the Johns, the sex buyers, can actually sue if they don't like the service. They don't care. I believe of course it's a fait accompli in Victoria, but we've still got Queensland and South Australia and Western Australia that we can fight against. Speaking of Western Australia, yeah, it is technically criminalised here, but 40 miles away from me, there's a small city called Albany. I'm here in Denmark on the Kurubup country, the River Kurubup. There was, a brothel raided, and they deported Chinese national women, and you couldn't find out what happened to the rest of the women in the brothel. And when I spoke to the journalist about it, they didn't even think to ask what happened to the women. It was all about border force, security, and yeah. So I just want to. That's by way of a bit of a messy introduction. I'm just so enraged just hearing it again. The encapsulated by Tegan and Megan there.
So Simone, you wanted us to share a map of the Indigenous territories.
Yeah.
Hold on a second, let me see. Indigenous First Nations map. So this is a map. Is it a current one, or is this a colonial Australian one? Can you describe this?
It was created by a white man. I think it was about 40 years ago, but the boundaries are really pretty accurate. So yeah, and I'm aware that a lot of people may not be able to see that to read it, but all the different colors will show you that there are at least 300 nations in this land. So we're not a homogenous group of people, but we're the oldest living culture in the world, and managed to get along pretty nicely without having prostitution here ever until it was imported in 1788 with the colonizers, invaders.
Thank you so much. And we'll get back to you, Simone, on a few points. We just wanted to hear from Kay, since we haven't heard from you yet, on your
thoughts. Hi, Taina.
Hi, Kay. Thank you so much for joining us. So what are your thoughts on this bill, and do you think it's a done deal, as Megan and Tegan believe?
It is unfortunately a done deal. I'd like to speak specifically to the issue of commercial sex trafficking. Before I do, I will also acknowledge that I am currently on the unceded lands of the Bunurong language group of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. As you've already outlined, Taina and Tegan as well, the illegal sex industry here in Melbourne, after more than 30 years of a legalised industry, is enormous. It's huge and it's significant. As Tegan outlined, we have approximately 90 legal prostitution businesses here in Victoria, and 500 illegal businesses operating primarily through massage parlours. And partly what that tells us is that sex trafficking is a very significant problem here, and that it's entrenched following from the normalisation and the legalisation of the sex industry. We know that women of colour, migrant women and First Nations women are vastly overrepresented in the Victorian sex industry. We also know that organised crime groups, criminal syndicates, outlawed motorcycle gangs are heavily involved in the Victorian sex trade. To give you a couple of examples of this, in the early 2010s, there were numerous high-profile news stories which documented the very significant involvement of Chinese criminal syndicates who were involved in trafficking women from Asia into the Melbourne-based sex industry. The traffickers would use student visas and tourist visas to bring women into Australia, and then would prostitute them under conditions of debt bondage. This would occur in the legal brothels themselves, as well as in massage parlours, and also in situations where the legal brothels quite literally act as a front for the illegal businesses. The front of the house would be a legal brothel, and then upstairs or at the back, there'd be an illegal trade in operation. In the last few years, in just the last 2 years, in fact, there's also been evidence of similar criminal syndicates operating in tandem with our major casino here in Melbourne as a way to lure high rollers into the casino through the provision of sexual services with trafficked women, primarily from Asia and in particular China. And so in light of these factors, we have every reason to believe that the new legislation, the full decriminalisation of prostitution in Victoria, will lead to significant increases in trafficking for commercial sexual exploitation. International academic research tells us that this will be the case, and evidence on the ground tells us that this will be the case as well. In terms of scholarship, international studies show that when you remove the barriers for the industry grows. There's one very well regarded, I should say, study done by economists across 150 countries, which shows that with decriminalisation and legalisation, there are larger inflows of trafficked persons. Decriminalisation, quite straightforwardly, under the laws of capitalism, fuels demand, and in doing so, it fuels the growth of the illegal industry and consequently sex trafficking. But the other thing that's really worth noting is that we have a lot of evidence for us in Victoria, a lot of evidence very close to home to demonstrate that decriminalisation greatly increases sex trafficking, or at least, or the most generous way I could put it is that it does nothing to reduce its occurrence. New Zealand, which is very close to us here in Victoria, we sort of say it's just over the ditch to us. New Zealand has had, I should say, full decriminalisation of the sex industry since 2003. In the 2019 US State Department's TIP report, the Trafficking in Persons report, New Zealand was identified as a hotspot for sexual exploitation. Even closer still, we have the example of New South Wales, which Megan touched on when she was describing our hodgepodge sex industry legislation in Australia. New South Wales is just north to us in Victoria. It fully decriminalised its sex industry in the mid-1990s, I think it was 95. At that point in 1995, our federal police, the Australian Federal Police, told us that in Sydney alone, there were 500 trafficked women working in Sydney's brothels. Since that time, in the mid-1990s, when that stat emerged and when the state fully decriminalised the sex industry, since that time, both the local New South Wales Police and the Australian Federal Police have provided evidence to parliamentary inquiries noting that sex slavery remains rife in the New South Wales sex industry and that it's in fact increasing. They explain that criminal syndicates are heavily involved in the decriminalised New South Wales sex trade, that these organised crime groups bring women into Australia primarily from Asia using tourist or student visas, and they facilitate their sexual abuse under conditions of debt bondage, as well as other forms of abuse. In particular, forced drug taking seems to be a constant theme emerging from the evidence that authorities are giving to these parliamentary inquiries. And what's really interesting to note is that police themselves recognise, they tell the government that it's the profound lack of oversight over the sex industry that comes with a decriminalised system. They say having next to no regulation is what enables and encourages the involvement of organised crime in the Australian sex industry, leading subsequently to trafficking. And so I think there's a lot of concern for those of us here in Victoria that we're going to be facing an even more severe situation than what we've already had under legalisation as a consequence of this new legislation.
And Kay, while I have you here, I'm going to ask you a follow-up question. As you know, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Trafficking recognized forced marriage and girl marriage as forms of sex trafficking. What, in terms of the new legislation, what does that mean for implications with respect to trafficking of girls and women for forced marriage?
Yeah, it's a really worthwhile question to be asking, Taina. And the relationship between marriage and trafficking it's a complex and it's an interesting one in the Australian context. To give you a little bit of background, in 2013, our federal government, which has responsibility for addressing human trafficking compared to the states, which can legislate on the sex industry, the federal government, with its responsibilities for trafficking, passed legislation which recognised forced marriage as a crime and as a type of human trafficking. And on the whole, this is a very good thing. Obviously, forced marriage involves multiple egregious human rights violations and should be recognised as a type of trafficking. But arguably, one of the consequences of this recognition of forced marriage as a type of trafficking has been to put commercial sex trafficking on the back burner and to pay it far less attention than should actually be the case. And one of the reasons I say this is because Australia is still a very racist country. I'm sure that's not a lot of new information to anyone listening, but as a colonial state, it's a very racist country. And the discourse on forced marriage in Australia has really involved an othering. It constructs forced marriage as the problem of the other, of other cultures, of particular communities, in particular migrant communities in Australia. And one of the implications of that discursive construction has been to leave majority culture or mainstream culture forms of sexual exploitation of women untouched. And this was actually recognised to a certain extent in the US State Department's TIP report from 2018 or 19, I can't remember, where the State Department told us that the Australian government has decreased law enforcement efforts around commercial sexual exploitation and trafficking. And it also noted in particular that education programs around trafficking in Australia have in fact neglected commercial sex trafficking as a consequence of this focus on forced marriage. It actually said that there's been an exclusion of education programs on commercial sex trafficking due to this focus on forced marriage. And so in terms of what this means with regards to the new law, I think for many of us, the new law represents the further entrenchment of this approach by both our state and federal governments, which refuses to recognise the harms of the sex industry, its links to trafficking. And while it's great that forced marriage is recognised as a type of trafficking, unfortunately, it's provided a point of diversion almost for the government and a way to neglect the majority culture or mainstream culture forms of male sexual entitlement that continue to go unabated.
Thank you so much. So it's unbelievable how quickly the time is flying, because we promised the public that we'd give them 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A. So one of you, I don't know if it's Tegan or Megan, said that the premise that prostitution is inevitable is based on two interrelated deep core Australian beliefs: that men have a right to sex and that most women are willing participants in prostitution, making it a victimless crime. So it's a lot to unpack here. And before we give it to the public, if each of you could talk about the cultural impacts, how it's baked in our culture. 3 of you are academics. We know academic institutions are churning out pro-prostitution advocates every year. And then in particular, Simone, if you could tell us, since you were a former member of Amnesty International, like what I would say, the male-dominated human rights movement has been doing in this area, unfortunately. So Tegan, would you like to start?
Sure. Yeah, so I think what you're kind of touching on there, or what I was getting at with that was the inevitability kind of premise that seems to be there in the earliest iterations of prostitution policies. So even dating back to the 1800s, there's this idea that prostitution has always and will always exist, and it's there's nothing we can do to abolish the industry. All we can do is kind of try to reduce the harm or minimize the harm, or section it to off from certain areas of respectable society into certain zones. And that was established really early on and continued to form the premise of prostitution legislation throughout Victoria's legislative history, and is present in the current Sex Work Act of legalization, which literally zones prostitution to certain geographic areas, and also was based on this kind of principle of harm minimization. So trying to kind of mitigate the harms, acknowledging harms, recognizing that they can't be completely abolished, but trying instead to kind of minimize those effects. And I think decrim it also contains some of that harm minimization principle, but it goes further than that to kind of embrace this sex work ideology. So I think what I guess a danger was, or what we saw happen, which I kind of touched on with the legalization, was although it was brought in not on the idea that sex work is work, a legitimate form of work, it was brought in to reduce the harm. It's then morphed into sex work is work, and now we've got decriminalization, which really reframes the harms as occurring because of stigma and discrimination, and then tries to combat that through treating prostitution literally the same as any other work. So it's a bit of an ideological shift, which I think other jurisdictions should take as a warning that any of these kinds of measures that I guess people and feminists even compromise on because they see it as a kind of short-term strategy, or as a way to kind of reduce the harms of what's already happening, actually has these disastrous long-term effects, because it really entrenches and reinforces this ideological underpinning.
Can I just add to that? I think that I'm very much in agreement with Tegan. I think this needs to be a warning to what could happen elsewhere. But I think there are also some cultural factors in Australia that perhaps exacerbate elements of this. And I think the sort of white hegemonic Australian masculinity is a big part of this, and the way that still really dominates Australian politics in particular, other elements of public life too, absolutely. And I think one of the best examples recently I can give you of how much that is still entrenched is back earlier this year when we had COVID-0 and we were living a little bit more normally. You had thousands of women marching in the streets around violence against women, men's violence against women, spurred on by a number of things, but one was that a woman had come out and said that she had been raped in Parliament House. And so there were floods of women on the streets, kind of this anger was building. You almost felt change might come of it. And our Prime Minister stood up in Parliament and said, "Isn't democracy great? There are other countries in the world where protesters are shot." That was his response to that. And the fact that he is not unseated as a result of that, the fact that, we have what my partner, who's not from Australia, calls the rule of bloke. and it is that these blokes in the sort of Australian parlance rule everything. It's just as Simone said, you know, run by a bunch of yahoos. That is still very, very entrenched, and I think contributes to this problem, and also contributes to the censorship of abolitionist feminism. I think it's very, you know, difficult to get any traction for the idea that any curtailing of the sex industry could come from a feminist analysis. It gets very much mischaracterized, I think, as a kind of prudish or religious argument only in Australia. But of course, that is fueled by this masculinity that involves sexual entitlement, and not being able to challenge this rule of bloke creates a culture where it's very easy to, you know, sort of malign or marginalize women who are making these feminist arguments. I wouldn't say we ever had a very strong feminist movement that criticized prostitution and sexual exploitation here, going all the way back decades. Obviously, some of us exist, and we do the best we can, but it is really extraordinary to see, I would say, the way that the rule of bloke across politics and the media really stifles feminist activists and feminist analyses.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, we've got the racism and the fact that it very much feels like a culture of high school jocks, I suppose, would be the American equivalent. That we're dealing with a group of people running the country who are like adolescents, but I don't want to be mean about adolescents because, you know, some of them are so on the ball. I don't know. They're from an era where really misogyny is okay as long as you virtue signal and pretend that it's not happening. But as you stated, Megs, Scott Morrison, our Prime Minister, was quite open, like, you know, about, you know, perhaps we should be shot for speaking out. But the contempt and the misogyny that we've got happening here is incredible. I think the other reality in regards to the culture is kind of it's a universal one, in the sense that in the history of the social regard for women in prostitution is that we were morally, you know, inferior, and also, you know, 100 years ago, definitely intellectually inferior, and they're so cocky and rude and, again, contemptuous, that they're telling us now that it's okay, women, you're not stupid anymore. We don't think you're dumb. We think that you're savvy and empowered if you do sex work. And this is really that's about as much as it has changed. And we've just failed, not for lack of trying, in convincing people that there is no distinction between so-called consensual sex work and trafficking. And also we forget about domestic trafficking in this country of the most marginalised women, i.e. the Indigenous women of the country.
And do you want to talk a little bit about sort of the culture around the human rights world? And what I call them the regressive progressives. But
yeah, absolutely. Very in regards to women's roles, they're highly conservative and regressive and restrictive. They, you know, I think Andrew Dawkins said, you know, the right want to own women in their homes. I'm paraphrasing her horribly. And the left want women to be publicly available to all of them. These are the men. Okay, but now it's beyond insane. I think a lot of people watching might already know about the capture of the human rights organisations. In Australia, it played out that most of the actual, you know, paying members, the decent citizens who really cared about human rights violations, didn't even read their decriminalisation sex work policy, because it was wasn't even on the Australian website. So when we as feminists attended the AGMs, the people, the fee-paying Amnesty members hadn't even read it, and the only thing that they would, you know, the president would talk about was, oh, it's just to decriminalise the women to make sure that they're safer. And so, of course, every decent person just went, oh, yeah, of course, absolutely. So we stood up at various AGMs in the different states and territories and said, no, that's not what it is. And that's not what's happening. They're actually empowering and deregulating pimping and empowering all the sex buyers. Then the sort of the fee-paying members were interested enough, to make me their human rights delegate, and I went to the nation's capital with some awesome feminist friends, and Australian activists, and we actually won here in Australia, and that is even against these contemptuous people who were just treating us so badly. And, one of my survivor sisters, who's a really, really powerful activist, actually had to leave the room. We were being jeered at, we were being yelled at when they were asking what we should call Aboriginal Australians, and I suggested Indigenous or First Nations. They told me no, and there were no other Indigenous people in the room. It was pretty appalling, but where they got it wrong, and I'm hoping that this will happen eventually in Australia, is that they didn't read the room of the members that had come along and were watching this play out, and they were horrified, and they were motivated. They just said, no, we are not going to. When we put the votes in and the audience watching that, who were actual members, saw what was happening, they said, no, Amnesty's policy should not be to decriminalize. Of course, we know we lost the battle globally, but yes, I'm pretty sure that most of these human rights organisations have been completely captured.
Yeah, no, I don't think, we lost a small battle. This is a very long, when I complain, Professor Catherine McKinnon always tells me this is a 1,000-year plan, right? So I do think what you each presented so brilliantly is an extremely grim picture, but we're still standing. And I think people who are listening to us and those who will listen in after the live program want to know not only that there's hope, but what they can do. Tegan and I always wonder, what is Victoria's or Australia's Achilles heel? And we know there is survivor leaders. What you just described, Simone, was a tremendous victory, just a handful of people advocating. So for our final words, what are your words of hope and advocacy for the future? Yes, Kay.
Yeah, the thing that really stands out to me is the importance of supporting survivors and survivor organisations. The corrupt process that we've had in Victoria shows how political interest, political power and motivation can literally block out an entire voice, and arguably the most critical voice in this debate. And so whether it's, if people are trying to think of what can I be doing to have a meaningful impact, to do something about this horrific situation that we've been describing to you, I think the number one thing for me is supporting survivors, whether it's donating to survivor organisations, providing funding to hear them speak, whether it's just offering a platform or even words of appreciation. It's I'm not a survivor, but I can only imagine how difficult it must be to speak about these things. And Simone, that rage that you were channeling for us before is so important. And yeah, I think it's absolutely crucial that we give survivors the platform and support and appreciation that they need and they deserve.
I think too, 100% echo what Kay said, and another way maybe to do that, as well as to help all activists working in this area in Australia, as I said before, is just talk about it. I think probably also the grim picture we've painted shows you how difficult it is to work internally. So external scrutiny is just so important to us. And that's, one reason why I think we're all so grateful that we can be here talking to you all today in this platform of people who maybe haven't heard about what's going on here. So I just think whenever you're in these discussions with other activists from around the world or legislators or advocacy groups, just say, have you seen what's happening in Australia? Because I really think you should have a look at it. It's not great, whenever people are talking about decrim, say, well, you want to see how the sex industry captured the legislature in Victoria, have a bit of a look at that. That is not a good outcome for anyone. And I think the more we can get this international attention and shine a light on, the corruption that has gone on here, the more that helps us, and it will help women struggling against this worldwide.
Yeah, exactly. And I think part of that has got to be like in Victoria, we're such a good example of prostitution, the kind of ideological capture, completely removing prostitution from any discussions on violence against women and becoming this kind of untouchable subject. So even within the violence against women sector, prostitution is kind of off limits, and so we're not applying the same kind of scrutiny or analyses that we would apply to women in other situations, because the sex industry has become this thing where it's kind of almost I guess it's so political that people don't want to look at it properly. So it's thriving under this kind of situation where we know that these things are happening. From what everyone said today, there is evidence, but it's kind of reframed as workplace conditions. It's not properly considered as it would be in other sectors. So I think just kind of maintaining that scrutiny or confronting, and part of that is listening to survivors, because they're the ones telling us what's really going on.
Do you want to add anything, Simone?
Yeah, I do, and I do agree with that. Thank you for that. But if you could also, if you're outside of Australia, hopefully you are, if you could get hold of your media, or if you could just get people to outrightly condemn what is happening here, and don't be afraid to attack the Australian government, including the Labor Party and the Greens, and all the people that I would normally lean to politically, just to say that you're shocked, or that that you care about the country, that you care about what's happening to Australia's reputation. Do whatever you can to get the media on board externally, so at least there's we might actually hit Australia that this is what's happening. That would be really, really helpful, I think. Yeah.
Well, thank you each so tremendously, not just for being on this panel, but for your daily courage, because these are acts of courage, what you're doing. You really are in the trenches. You are the resistance. Here in the US, we call ourselves the Underground Railroad, because just like Australia, the media is increasingly pro-prostitution, promoting the sex trade as an employer, a viable employer for the most vulnerable. And so, yes, we just want to let you know that the feminist movement, the abolitionist movement, and also the communities are all watching you, because we believe that the average person understands what exploitation is and looks like, and would not wish prostitution on any human being on the planet. If we're still standing on our feet next year, I would love to have another panel, like 1 year after the law. I understand that there will be no formal registries, right, as to how many brothels there are. Maybe one of you can talk about that, but it would be wonderful. Or even in 6 months from now, we are at your service. So I don't know if anybody has parting words in the last 2 minutes, and how the law will be monitored. I mean, I think that's when do you think it'll pass, and what will be the next developments or the implications or the impact of the decriminalization of the sex trade in Victoria?
Well, just quickly
probably
before
pass
the
today or tomorrow. Yeah.
the
Sorry,
legal. So just before the legal, brilliant academics here go forward. What I do know is that if as it has been, done and dusted with this bill, that prostitution is just sex work, then to quote Julie Bindel, then rape is just theft. We've already had that under the Victorian law, where a woman was tortured and raped, and due to the law, not due to a stigma, because stigma doesn't kill women in prostitution, men do. Due to the law, the judge it went in under a torture act because she had been tortured, but really because they couldn't establish whether or not she consented to that because of being a sex worker, and it's just another job. The man only got charged for theft of, and he had to replace her phone and some money from her wallet. So it will mean that poverty is just a choice that you've got because you'll always have prostitution. It means that, even if you're dying in a gutter, then you've always got prostitution. It just means that we won't be able to actually use any of the human rights that we fought so hard for. This will be the result of that. Yeah. So poverty will basically be a choice for women in Australia.
So with that, we're at 7 p.m. here, and what time over there? 8 a.m. and
11 in the morning here, and earlier for Simone.
Yeah, on behalf of CatW International and all of us around the world, I just wanted to thank you, and we will support your efforts, whatever they are. And when the law is passed, we'll issue a press release and perhaps a petition or whatever it is that you think is effective and can keep raising awareness about the atrocities that are about to explode further in Victoria, Australia. So thank you all. Stay strong, and we're sending you much gratitude for all of the extraordinary work that you've done, and a heartfelt thanks to you, Simone, for your courage.
Thank you, Taina, and all the wonderful women attending, and my beautiful, wonderful, kick-ass sisters here in Australia too. Thanks, Taina, and for all your work. Thank you.
Thanks to everyone who joined. Bye.
We'll see you in a year.
Or before.